I, sh I should say I immediately align myself to Janet's corporation of thieves. And as a semi-qualified thief, I will present the case of Mexico City as a possibility of thinking mobility beyond mobility. Is this working? Okay. Mexico City is it's an urban agglomeration of 19.1 million. Only less than half of those 19 million live within the federal district, not unlike many of the cities we have seen before. And it extends over 1,400 square kilometers. In a sense, Mexico City is a result, it's a palimpsest of many of the transportation decisions that have been taken over the past 50 years. The peripheral roads, the ejes viales, and most recently the elevated highways. Mexico City, if you look at how the transportation is divided between public and private, 82% of the trips are taken through public transportation. And if you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that it's a system that combines polycentricity in terms of many peripheries, housing a lot of people, but on the other hand, most of the trips are still made at one time of the day towards the center. Recent projects in previous administrations have usually focused on the idea of maximizing capacity for that 18%, which is basically the private car. The most notable of these are the overpasses. This is the one in Santa Catarina, and the most infamous of this is the elevated, the segundos pisos or elevated highways. The sign on the left says, if you use your skateboard, you'd arrive sooner. Not all is that bad. Recently, two big projects have shown the possibility of a new attitude towards transport. One of them is the Metrobus, modeled after the Bogota and the Curitiba examples, which is the only public transportation system that has been growing consistently 6% every year. It is a proved success, and the one on the right is a new suburban train, which after many years of abandoning radial trains, Mexico City is beginning to think again. The two projects our office is currently involved are two sides of the same coin. One of them is for the federal district, actually commissioned by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. The other one is, and we're doing hand in hand with Transconsult, transportation consultancy for the state of Mexico. If you look at those two orange and red marks, those are the two corridors. What seems to be counterintuitive here, and which is important, is that we find in Mexico City a periphery that it is more dense than the central areas. How should the mobility projects address these issues with regards to densification, urban development, public space, etc.? The first project is the Eje Central corridor. Eje Central is a 12-kilometer long street that bisects Mexico City from north to south, almost in its central area. It has a history, and these are images from the 1950s, paintings by Dr. Atl, which would be equated to Mexico City's Broadway Avenue. It had the most important theaters, the most important cinemas. It was a 24-hour city corridor that nevertheless, in the past 40 years, due to focusing exclusively only on transportation measures, became a corridor in which you had a fragmented system with electrical buses, microbuses, private taxis, and other concession of gasoline buses. In a sense, it's in a very inhospitable street, 6 lanes in which there's no rule of law in terms of who occupies which lane. Very unfriendly to cyclists, and actually the privatization of the sidewalks meant that actually people had to go into the street and walk, creating again inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in terms of the public transportation system. The first big measure, and I should credit Philip Roth in a meeting we had with the Minister of Urban Development in Mexico, is to actually convince the Mexican authorities to engage in a project which basically gave half of that corridor back to public transportation. First, as a BRT project, a bus rapid transit, and second, as a very generous bicycle pathway with a local access road. This is a big change, and it is one of the points I'd like to make. There is a possibility to use urban design planning and architecture as a leverage tool to convince politicians about the pertinence of certain decisions. Another big part of this project has to do with safety crossings. Eje Central is currently the most dangerous street in the city, both for car drivers and for pedestrians. More than 10 people get killed every year. And in a sense, this issue of safety crossings had to do with handicap accessibility, more generous space for the pedestrians, better information both in horizontal and in vertical signage. In a sense, we're hoping that by changing each of these corners, each of these intersections, by addressing the transportation project through the streetscape, we can radically change the way the Eje Central project is developed. The other part has to do with urban development. Land use, density, building height, and public space were crucial to the development of this project. Traversing the city north to south, it means that it has a lot of programs, it has a lot of public spaces connected, and this is where we worked between architecture and urban planning. If you see the drawing on the left shows the current height of buildings as Eje Central is built. On the right is what actually current urban norms allow. So there's a deficit in which current norms are not allowing for the full potential of the corridor to be developed. We proposed a series of measures, including zero parking housing, in which we would foresee that over the next 4 years, this would become a dense corridor. This would not only happen lengthwise, but actually at the level of the block. At the level of the block, modifying a series of variables which are the obstacles for more sustainable development. One of them is addressing the issues of public space, but also addressing the issue of live and work spaces, the use of the ground floors for other commercial uses. So in a sense, we're thinking that by changing these regulations, the way we occupy not just the transportation policy, but also the urban policy will radically change. The other corridor is the Neza-Chimalhuacan corridor on the eastern part of Mexico City. If you look at this area, this mega grid, it's a 1.4 million inhabitant city developed informally. If you add Chimalhuacan, which is the radial sort of a fan on the right, it is a city that has been growing over the last 40 years as big as Barcelona, with a completely disarticulated transportation policy. This is all self-built, if you find it hard to believe. And yet, for those of you who were in Mexico City during the Urban Age conference, it is an extremely vital and extremely alive community. This is actually denser, and it has more jobs than the central districts I showed before. So in the context of how does mobility beyond mobility address the problems of a corridor on the peripheries versus a corridor on the center, is where we have actually tried to use architecture, urban planning, and design as a leverage. The new corridor will actually use one of these kilometer-long grid. The corridor in Neza-Chimalhuacan moves 18 kilometers from Pantitlan, an exchange station on the federal district, all the way to Chimalhuacan. And this is kind of some of the views of that corridor as we find it nowadays. And it obviously follows the examples that both Fabio, the mayor of Lima, and Janet had talked earlier. The further we move away from the corridor, the less urban it becomes, and we get to the edge of the city, where only 10% of the streets are paved. In a sense, the question, and if you look at how the origin of the trips and the destination of the trips is targeted, it is obvious that Neza is not a periphery, it's not a bedroom community. Actually, there's a lot of intra-mobility, which makes the discussion of the corridor relevant. It's not only the site for one corridor, but actually could represent the place of many other corridors over the foreseeable future. One of the issues we have been discussing and bringing to the table, and this I should say different from the federal district, it is a project promoted by the Ministry of Transportation. No other agenda aside from transportation. And this is where design and planning comes in. And we have been able to convince the client to bring in a new cycleway, which would become a 15-kilometer long cycleway, linking all, moving along this median and making this a sort of bicycle boulevard. The questions and to raise the issues, I just would like to go back to the issue of how do we use knowledge in regards to power, and what's the role of the designer, the planner, the architect in this context. I like to introduce two issues. One is the idea of the genetically modified infrastructure. The idea that by modifying the way we conceive infrastructure, we can bring in a broader agenda to include issues of public space, density, new modalities, and it's a way of getting beyond problem solving. The other, and I'm stealing Saskia's term, which is the intensive periphery. We change the way we understand the periphery, we change the protocols, and architects and designers can get a better leverage with politicians and decision makers. Thank you very much.